Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man.
Uninteresting is the truth, simply because I'm not sure that we're going to come to any sort of consensus.
That's the moment, right there, when Ben Shapiro, one of the sharpest minds in political commentary, essentially dismisses the historical case for Christianity's central claim. What you're about to witness is not a polite interfaith dialogue. This is William Lane Craig, a philosopher who has built his entire academic career on defending the resurrection, sitting across from Ben Shapiro, a devout Jew who views Jesus as a failed messianic claimant. One man believes he has irrefutable historical evidence. The other thinks the conversation itself is pointless. Watch how Craig systematically constructs his case. Watch how Ben deflects. And watch what happens when two brilliant minds collide over the question that has divided Judaism and Christianity for 2 millennia. Craig is known for his precision. He doesn't make emotional appeals. He builds arguments like a prosecutor building a case, layer by layer, fact by fact. And in this conversation, he's going to use 3 specific historical facts to corner Ben Shapiro into a position where he must either accept the resurrection or explain away evidence that even skeptical scholars acknowledge. Ben Shapiro is no easy target. He's a trained attorney. He knows how to spot weak arguments. And he's about to challenge every claim Craig makes. This is the moment Craig has been preparing for. The conversation begins with what seems like a simple question. But Craig knows exactly where he's going. He starts by establishing the religio-historical context. This isn't random. It's strategic.
Of the life and ministry of Jesus. I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets.
Notice what Craig is doing here. He's not starting with the resurrection. He's starting with identity. Who did Jesus claim to be? Because if Jesus made blasphemous claims, then his resurrection becomes God's validation of those claims. Ben sees this coming, and he immediately attacks the premise.
This narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually...
Right.
Ben's point is sharp. Many Jews throughout history have claimed to be the Messiah. Why was Jesus different? This is a legitimate challenge, and Craig knows he needs to address it directly. Here's where Craig makes his move.
In saying that Jesus' understanding of the Messiah was radically different from the prevailing cultural understanding of the Messiah among the chief priests and the common people. And he didn't meet their expectations. Indeed, that's what helped to get him crucified. Being the Messiah, you're right, in and of itself isn't a blasphemous claim. But to claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous and is sufficient for his condemnation.
This is the setup. Craig has just acknowledged Ben's point and then elevated it. Yes, claiming to be Messiah wasn't blasphemous, but Jesus didn't just claim to be a political Messiah. He claimed divine status. He claimed to sit at God's right hand. That's what got him killed. Now comes the critical question.
Now, the question, I think, that is raised by your
interpretation,
question, Ben,
yes.
your interpretation, Ben, is this. Why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held?
Watch this moment carefully. Craig has set the trap. He's forced the question into a corner. If Jesus was just another failed messianic claimant with a radical reinterpretation, why should anyone believe him? And then Craig delivers his answer.
And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead.
4 seconds. That's all it takes. The entire argument pivots on those 4 seconds. But Craig doesn't stop there. He knows Ben needs more than a simple assertion. So he builds the theological framework.
Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be.
Think about what Craig just did. He reframed the resurrection as God's answer to the blasphemy charge. If God raised Jesus from the dead, then God was saying the chief priests were wrong and Jesus was right. This is where Ben could have walked away. He could have accepted the argument as a matter of faith. But Ben Shapiro doesn't do that. He challenges the premise.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
Brilliant counter. If resurrection proves divinity, then Lazarus must be divine. Ben has found what he thinks is a fatal flaw in Craig's logic. Craig saw this coming.
Before we talked about the resurrection, a miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection...
This is masterful. Craig just explained why context matters. Lazarus didn't claim to be God. Jesus did. The resurrection of Lazarus was a miracle performed by Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus was God's vindication of Jesus. But Craig knows he needs more than theology. He needs history. And this is where the conversation shifts from philosophy to evidence. Ben challenges the historical reliability of the Gospels. He points out they were written decades after Jesus died. 40 years is a long time. Memories fade. Stories change. How can we trust documents written so long after the events? Craig's response is methodical. He doesn't get defensive. He gets academic.
In order for a historical document to be reliable, it isn't required that it be inerrant.
Contemporaneous, of course.
So,
of course.
He's establishing a principle. Historical reliability doesn't require eyewitness accounts written the same day. It requires early sources that can be verified. And then Craig launches into what he clearly considers his strongest argument.
The inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great, independently established facts, which are supported by the historical evidence, and which surprisingly, I did my doctoral work on this in Germany, are recognized as such by the majority of New Testament scholars today who studied the historical Jesus. And these facts would be...
Notice the credentials drop. I did my doctoral work on this in Germany. Craig is establishing his expertise. He's not a casual observer. He's a specialist. And he's about to cite the scholarly consensus.
That after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary.
Three facts. Empty tomb. Appearances. Belief. Craig has just laid out his case like a lawyer presenting evidence. He's not arguing theology anymore. He's arguing history, and then he makes a stunning claim.
The vast majority of scholars have come to accept as convincing the evidence in support of those three facts, not assuming biblical inerrancy or inspiration.
This is Craig's power move. He's not asking Ben to accept the Bible as divine revelation. He's asking him to accept what secular scholars accept when they treat the Gospels as historical sources.
That individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead.
Hear what he's saying. The facts aren't disputed. What's disputed is the explanation. Craig continues building his case.
Attempts have been made to explain these facts without recourse to the resurrection, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. And I would argue that none of these naturalistic theories meets the criteria for being the best historical explanation of the facts. None of them.
He's eliminated the alternatives. Conspiracy doesn't explain the empty tomb. Apparent death doesn't explain the appearances to groups. Hallucinations don't happen to groups simultaneously.
Is as good an explanation as the one that the original disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead.
This is the climax of Craig's argument. He's used history to argue for a miracle. He's shown that naturalistic explanations fail. And he's claimed that the resurrection is the best explanation of the historical evidence. And that's when Ben Shapiro does something remarkable. He doesn't engage the argument. He dismisses the entire framework.
So we can have the historical argument back and forth, obviously, and I think that there are arguments that you can make. I think there are arguments that I can make, but I honestly find them relatively uninteresting, is the truth, simply because I'm not sure that we're going to come to any sort of consensus.
Let that sink in. Ben Shapiro, who built his career on rigorous debate, just said he finds the historical argument for Christianity uninteresting. Not wrong. Uninteresting. This is a defensive move. And Craig knows it. Because Ben's next argument reveals why he's deflecting. He brings up the Lubavitcher Rebbe, a Jewish rabbi who died in the 1990s. Some of his followers still believe he's the Messiah. Some even claim he's still alive.
Easy to claim. There's a sect of Judaism right now in which there's a small subsection of people who believe that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is still alive. Right? The Lubavitcher Rebbe passed away in the 1990s.
Yes.
And there's still people who treat him as though he is not dead. They call him the Messiah. They think that he was the political Messiah. They have, and they still do that 20 years after his death. You know, that's not proof to me that he is actually.
Ben's argument is clear. If people can believe the Rebbe is still alive 40 years after his death, why should we trust claims about Jesus 2,000 years later? It's a good rhetorical point, but Craig has an answer.
Then
that's an important difference, Ben. The important time gap is not the gap between the events and the present. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence just because of the lapse of time. The critical event, as you just said, is...
Craig is making a distinction. The Rebbe's followers are making claims 70 years after his death with no contemporary documentation. The gospel writers had sources within 5 to 40 years of Jesus' crucifixion.
Of the events of the life of Jesus and his resurrection, that time gap is extraordinarily narrow. We can push back even before the writing of the Gospels and the epistles of Paul by discerning the traditions upon which they relied when they wrote. And some of these go back to within, it's estimated, 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion.
5 years. That's Craig's closing argument. The earliest Christian testimony about the resurrection dates to within 5 years of the event. That's not legend. That's testimony. So what just happened here? William Lane Craig systematically built a historical case for the resurrection. He used scholarly consensus. He cited early sources. He eliminated alternative explanations. He argued that the resurrection is the best explanation for 3 independently attested historical facts. Ben Shapiro challenged the premise, questioned the sources, and then ultimately dismissed the entire line of argument as uninteresting because it wouldn't lead to consensus. This reveals something profound about the divide between Judaism and Christianity. It's not just about interpreting the same text differently. It's about whether historical evidence can ever be sufficient to prove a theological claim. For Craig, the resurrection is a historical event that can be established through normal historical methods. For Ben, it's a faith claim that lies outside the bounds of historical proof. Who's right? That question has divided 2 great faiths for 2,000 years. And as this conversation shows, brilliant minds on both sides can look at the same evidence and reach completely different conclusions. The difference isn't intelligence. It's starting assumptions. Do you begin with the assumption that miracles are possible, or do you begin with the assumption that naturalistic explanations must exist even if we haven't found them yet? Your answer to that question will determine how you interpret the evidence. And that, ultimately, is what this conversation reveals. The resurrection isn't just a historical question. It's a philosophical question. It's a question about whether God can act in history, and whether historical evidence can ever be sufficient to prove that he did. William Lane Craig believes the evidence is overwhelming. Ben Shapiro believes the conversation is uninteresting. And between those two positions lies the great divide between Christianity and Judaism. This conversation matters because it shows us that faith and reason aren't enemies. They're partners. Craig uses reason to support faith. Ben uses reason to question faith. Both are intellectually honest. Both are rigorously logical, but they reach different conclusions. Because at the end of the day, the resurrection isn't just about empty tombs and appearance claims. It's about whether you're willing to accept that God vindicated a man who claimed to be his son. And that's a decision no amount of historical evidence can make for you. If this conversation challenged you, made you think, or helped you understand the stakes of this debate, consider exploring these questions further. The evidence is there. The arguments have been made. The question is whether you're willing to follow them to their conclusion.